So for today's video, I want to talk about identity, the big reality question, because when we ask what is reality and we ask who am I, they're basically the same question. And I'm going to do a couple things. One is I'm going to talk about Nisargadatta and the very basics. What's the gist? And the issue of identifying with the body. Then I want to talk about this recent movie called The Substance, because there's really only one problem. We talk about reality, we talk about identity. It's the same problem. Who am I? And when it comes to identities, there is a sucker born every minute when it comes to us humans, because this doesn't happen with any other species. At least I don't think so. It's not like turtles and birds are flying around wondering who they are. But us humans, we fall for it very easily. And I remember, maybe I was 15, I worked at this convenience store, and it always irritated me about identities. Like, I didn't want to identify. Like, I could just work here. I'm not the store. And people would come into the store and they would ask, "Oh, where are your chips?" And I would say, "Well, my chips are at my house in a cabinet." Now, I knew what they were asking. They wanted to know where were the chips at the store, but I refused to identify with working there. But of course, refusing to identify to work there is also became an identity of sorts. And that's why the identity trick is so tricky, because we can try to weasel our way out of it, but in getting out of it, we're still in it. And of course, that's a lot of the little knots that we deal with as human beings. But when it comes to the body, it's particularly tricky to not identify with the body, because it appears as though the eyes give rise to vision, and the ears give rise to hearing, and the fingers give rise to touch. On the other hand, we could ask, what is it that passes through the eyes that allows vision? What is it that passes through the ears that allows hearing? And what is it that passes through the fingers that allows for touch? And that's where we're at with this video. One is identification with the body, and the other is maybe there's something else, and that this is the meatsuit hypothesis. This is just something that we're wearing temporarily. And so I thought I'd give you a few quotes from Nisargadatta, and then we'll deal with this Substance movie. Kind of random. I just made a few marks here. The body is present and has form, but upon what does this form depend? What came before the form? What came before the whole of existence? You think you're responsible for the body's actions because you believe yourself to be the body. At times, you feel so weary, and at times you enjoy limited pleasure. You experience loss of everything day by day due to your identification with the body, and you ultimately experience death. Again, just a few more to show the difficulties of identifying with the body. You are suffering because you identify yourself as a body, but in reality, your true nature is the supreme reality. Because of your body identity, you feel separate from what you truly are. So that's one of the first issues. Is when you look at the 5 poisons in yoga, the causes of suffering, the first is ignorance. Ignorance of the true nature of reality. And so when we think we're the body, that is ignorance, and that alone can cause suffering. And I think that's the point that Nisargadatta is making. One more, and then we'll get to the substance. This is interesting, because again, it talks about how the mind is one of the issues that allows us for this body identification. And so mind means ideas and flow of thoughts. The mind and its ideas entertain the person so that he or she is distracted from truly looking at themselves. In other words, being the consciousness that looks through the eyes, we become more identified with the physical aspects themselves. In turn, worldly activities result from the flow of thought. These activities are extensions of our ideas. Mind, intellect, and the I am consciousness are the names given to pure awareness. Your mind gives you your body identity, and this results in misery and rebirth. And so it's all about the physicality that kind of keeps us here in these worldly events. Okay, now what does all this have to do with the substance? Well, I totally caught it by accident, sort of. People were talking about it, and did not watch it with any particularly mindfulness. So I could be off on a little of these ideas, but I think some of it is pretty interesting because the obvious setup is something that humans have played with quite often, the fountain of youth, and the main actress, she's very attractive, but in her 60s, and was going to lose her job. So if you haven't seen it yet, I'm going to give a couple things away with this, not the whole thing, but and gets seduced into this kind of Faustian deal where you can take this substance, and they don't get into the mechanics of it. Somehow another body emerges, and then you can spend 6 days in this youthful body, and on the 7th you have to spend 1 day a week in this older body. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And there could be some symbolism, on the 7th day kind of thing. Maybe, because that's at least where I took it in some ways. But there's what I call the substance paradox. And maybe it's tied in with this. It was all a test for her, because it's pretty obvious. They show the mansion that she lives in. She didn't need money. So in making this deal, it was all about vanity and the ego, which is strange because, again, she was in very good shape. She wasn't suffering physical pain. So it's not like she wanted to evade her current body for this youthful body because she was in physical pain. It was, again, all about the ego. And so they switched the bodies again, and the biggest question is, what was switching? In other words, when they call this the substance, I thought maybe what they're really getting at is, what is the substance that switches between the bodies? And that's something that we've asked as human beings for a very long time, because it gets back to the reality question: who am I? Is she some kind of consciousness that switches back and forth? Because there wasn't any physicality to it. There wasn't like a little self that would crawl from one body to the other, at least not that I noticed. And so it really asked the question, okay, who are we? What is it that's switching back and forth? And the reason I found that to be particularly interesting is because that might have been the test itself. And the whoever was the architect of this whole plan kept reminding her over and over, there's only one. So in other words, you have two bodies, but there's only one. And I kept thinking, this has to be one consciousness. In other words, the whole process was a test for her. So she would not identify with the body. I mean, if you keep going back and forth between two bodies, maybe it would occur to you that you're not a body. And unfortunately, this really never took place. She failed the test miserably, as if you end up watching it. And she sort of tries to cheat herself. And that's all because, of course, she was identifying with the body rather than letting the epiphany take place, letting this realization, like, what is it that's switching back and forth between these bodies? Why didn't that ever hit her consciousness? And so in a way, you could say maybe this whole thing was a test, a spiritual test. And the reason I think that might be on track is because, and if you noticed, no payment was required for this. And so the product, the substance, just kept showing up for you all the time that you would need to use it. And not at any point was any payment required, which is pretty strange. If you even get some decent moisturizer, it can cost you like $50. So it's a little unusual that the Fountain of Youth wouldn't cost anything, which means maybe it wasn't the Fountain of Youth. It was a test to see, what is it exactly that we truly are? Are we the body? Are we the eye that manufactures vision? Or are we the consciousness that looks through the eye?